Welcome to Medicaid Mastery, a cut above explaining the real long-term care Medicaid system.
Hello and welcome to Medicaid Mastery with Florida Medicaid planning expert Antony Turbeville. I'm Evan Mack, and today we're diving into a fear some families face when it comes to Medicaid. Can the government take your home? We're going to clear up the confusion around estate recovery, explain how Florida handles property, and talk about what families can do to protect what matters most. Tony, welcome back.
Thank you for having me.
All righty. So this is, can Medicaid really take your home? What Florida families need to know about estate recovery. So first things first, can Medicaid really take your home after you pass away?
So no, not in Florida. There's a lot of misconception about this because there are many states who they don't technically take the home, they lien the home to recover the money that they've spent on somebody's care through Medicaid. But in Florida, that is not true. The home, the primary residence, the homestead property cannot be collected from by Medicaid, even if it goes through the probate process. So it's just a misunderstanding because a lot of Northerners come, and they know somebody up there and their home got liened and, maybe ate up all the equity in the home, and they come down here and they think that is true here. It just absolutely isn't true. Now, let me say, I am not an attorney and I cannot give legal advice, and you should not take this as legal advice, but I am telling you the things that you should be talking to your attorney about. We process applications and get the application through the system and develop all the strategies and help the family put all the papers together. Sort of, we act like a mortgage broker, so to speak, and package up that file in the best way possible. I cannot practice law, and you should talk to your attorney about it. But my understanding and my experience in over 17,000 cases is a home in Florida has never been taken.
So how does Florida treat a primary residence during the Medicaid eligibility process?
So unlike most states, Florida, even if you're single, does not count your primary residence. There's a couple of criteria, right? First, you have to have lived in the home immediately prior to leaving for a healthcare reason. Okay, so you had to live there. It had to be your primary residence at some point. Now, you may have left and gone to live with a child because of your health. That's okay. That doesn't interfere with it still being your primary residence for Medicaid purposes. So then secondly, you have to sign what's called an intent to return statement. Used to Florida, you had to have the intent to return, but it was just an understood thing. It was stated verbally. Nobody cared. Today, there's technically a form that should be filled out. It's a state of Florida form. Pretty simple. It's a simple statement saying, hey, this is the home I would intend to return to, and you sign it. And so that makes it your homestead property, and it just stays in place. Now, one thing to be aware of is that they don't allow you to keep any income to keep the property up. If you have a mortgage on it, they don't let you keep any money to make the payments. As far as out of your income flow, we can certainly help families protect the assets so that they have the money to support the house if they want to. And to go just a step further, oftentimes families don't want to keep the home, right? Because it's a burden. You got to mow the grass and pay the taxes and homeowners association dues and all that kind of stuff. So oftentimes families want to sell the house because they know mom or dad's never coming home, and then they want to protect those assets, and we can certainly help with that as well.
So can you tell the people at home what estate recovery is?
So estate recovery is the process of Medicaid coming back against a probate estate to collect money that they've paid out on behalf of the Medicaid recipient. So probate is the process of distributing assets through the court system. And again, not being an attorney, but the way I would explain it is there are much more efficient ways to pass assets to loved ones than going through the probate system. But if you haven't laid it out ahead of time in a way to avoid probate, then it's going to go through probate. Many people think a will avoids probate. Nothing could be further from the truth. A will guarantees probate for any assets that have not been left, say, by a beneficiary designation, joint tenancy with rights of survivorship, or some other mechanism, TOD, POD on brokerage accounts. There's a lot of ways to leave assets in effect with a beneficiary designation that avoids probate. If you do that, then the asset doesn't go through probate and it cannot be collected from in Florida. Now, I know we're Florida focused, but I always want to make sure I don't cause confusion for people. So in other states, they have an expanded definition of probate, some of them, and they will collect from things that don't go through probate. But in Florida, it's only what goes through probate. And if a home goes through probate, that's excluded, right? They can't collect from it because it's a protected or an exempt asset. So even if you don't leave the home in a more efficient manner and it goes through probate, Medicaid can't collect back from it.
So are there protections that help prevent a home from being subject to recovery?
Yeah, designating it as your primary residence with intent to return. That's what protects.
So how does it change things if a spouse or dependent is still living in the home?
So again, in Florida, it's really doesn't change because the home is
Okay.
protected even for a single person. In other states, that has a effect on whether they lien the property or do not lien the property.
And what about the property? Can it ever be transferred to children or any heir, like without triggering recovery?
So yeah, there are a few ways that can be done, but it's in very special circumstances. So if a child lived with a parent for 2 years immediately prior to them needing to apply for long-term care, and they delayed their application for long-term care, then you can transfer the home or any part of the home to the child that lived with you for the 2 years. And this doesn't apply to grandchildren or friends or neighbors, only the legal children. So adopted children count, biological children, stepchildren do not count. Okay. So they delayed that entrance, then the home can be transferred to them without any type of penalty.
So I know you're not a lawyer, but can you speak to some of the legal or maybe the planning tools that help shield a home from Medicaid claims?
Well, again, in Florida, you just really don't need to shield the home from Medicaid claims as long as you're representing it as the primary residence, you lived in it immediately prior, and you had stated that intent to return. There's no mechanism for Florida to collect, therefore there's no need to take any additional steps. By the way, let me also plug in that you can transfer a home to any disabled child, whether they live there or not, as well as any other assets to a disabled child. And I don't want to go too deep in the weeds, but you got to be careful not to transfer to a SSI disabled child. It needs to be an SSD, and we'll maybe get into that in another podcast. But the sibling of a Medicaid applicant, the home can also be transferred to if the sibling lived in that home and had what's called an ownership interest in the home, and they lived in it for 1 year. They didn't have to provide care. They didn't have to delay entrance. And an ownership interest would be considered if they can prove they paid to install a new air conditioner or a new roof or a new floor in the house, or they paid the property taxes, anything like that that would suggest that they had an ownership interest, not they own the whole property, right? But they took action to better that home essentially, then that can be transferred to the sibling with them living 1 year with no penalty or problems.
So can you share with us a real example, all the clients that you've had, maybe one where the home was successfully protected?
Sure. Let me point out that there is a limit on the equity that can be protected in the home. And even that's not said quite right. You can have 713,000 in 2025 when we're recording this of equity in your home. That's equity, not value. So if you have $1 million home with a $500,000 mortgage, it still qualifies under Medicaid. You have $1 million home with no mortgage, then you're over $713,000 in equity. And while they don't take your home, they do count that excess equity towards your eligibility. So there are plenty of ways to get rid of that excess equity if you know how to do it. And so I'm going to use that as an example. And listen, most people that come to us don't have $1 million homes. But here in Florida, it's getting to be where there's a lot of homes that are in that $700,000, $800,000 range. So you can run into this. So what you have to do is you have to transfer that excess equity to one of your children or whoever you want the assets to go to in exchange for some other asset that doesn't count. Here's kind of a summation. There's plenty of ways to restructure assets that keep you from qualifying for Medicaid by moving it to another type of asset. So if the home violates those equity positions, then you need to take some action to protect it. Otherwise, you don't. And it's not that you're protecting the home so much as you are making sure you can qualify for Medicaid in spite of the excess equity. So, for example, let's use that. And I'm not going to use a specific case, but this concept has been done many times for our clients. So we have somebody that, let's round it at 700. They got the million. They're $300,000 too rich for Medicaid. Well, we can sell, let's call it 40% of that $1 million house to one of the kids in exchange for a promissory note that doesn't count as an asset. So now there is a mortgage against that property, right, for the 400. So now there's no more equity, right? The equity's gone because that percentage ownership has been transferred to somebody else. So all that's left is the 60%, the 600,000 in equity. Now that promissory note has to be structured right so that it doesn't count as an asset, but it can be done. Now you've gotten rid of the excess equity and you have a promissory note that does not count when calculating eligibility.
So I know you said Florida is a bit different, but what would be your advice for anyone that's worried about losing their home due to Medicaid, maybe just generally?
I would say I wouldn't worry much about losing the home in Florida, right? If there's excess equity, you're certainly going to have to address that to qualify for Medicaid. But the biggest thing I would say, again, not legal advice, but something I see attorneys often recommend, and in fact, almost always, is to set up a ladybird deed. That is essentially a deed with a beneficiary designation for all practical purposes. So what happens is when the person passes away, you take that deed. You can record it ahead of time, or at death, you can take that with a death certificate down to the county clerk's office and record it, and then that property passes outside of probate. Even though Medicaid can't take your home in a probate situation, there's no reason to have to go through the expense and time and aggravation of going through a probate when it's so easily avoided. Now, attorney might, for various reasons, recommend a revocable living trust or some other mechanism for transferring it. But I would say the ladybird deed, also called an enhanced life estate, is the most common way to do it. So that would be the thing that I would consider for my own home. How do I get it to my heirs and bypass all the process and expense?
Amazing. Thank you for taking the time, Tony. Appreciate it.
You're so welcome. Thanks for having me.
And thank you all for tuning in to Medicaid Mastery with Tony Turbeville. If you or someone you love is worried about protecting the family home while navigating Medicaid, visit PLATBEN.com. That's platben.com for personalized guidance and expert help. Don't forget to subscribe, share this episode, and leave us a review. Thank you so much, guys.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.